Game 6 of the World Chess Championship. So far, the match just hasn't settled at all. It hasn't stabilised. We've had so many decisive games. Of course, Nepo won in round 5 with a beautiful strategic performance. So he leads 3-2 going into this 6th game. So could Ding strike back? Could Nepo just calm things down and maybe make a draw? Let's take a look. So Ding Liren with white, Jan Nepomniachtchi playing black. Ding opens with d4, so a change from the English. And here, instead of playing the usual c4, and actually Ding is a real specialist with the Catalan, he plays bishop f4. This is the so-called London system, which is incredibly popular. In fact, at all levels of chess, it's a very pragmatic move. Never been seen in a World Championship match before, but I think this is very typical of modern play, where you don't go for forcing variations because, everyone's got a strong computer, everyone prepares so well that actually those forcing variations, you don't get very far. But instead, you just want a position on the board. It's like in tennis, you just get the ball over the net, you play a slice serve, you don't go for a smash, basically. And that's the advantage of playing the London system. Black has a whole load of lines to pick, but there's nothing really forcing. By the way, for those of you who aren't sure, asking where the name the London system comes from, it comes from the London International Tournament 1922. There we are. There's my tournament book, a rather modern edition, where this London system with bishop f4 was played in several games, including a very nice victory of Alexander Alekhine against Ova. But that's another story. Okay, so what does Nepo play against it? Loads of things you can do here. You can play e6, you can play knight h5, or you take and play knight h5. Nepo plays something which looks very reliable. He exchanges on d4 and then plays bishop f5. So often in these systems, white wants to play the bishop to d3, and the bishop is on an excellent diagonal there. So bishop f5 is very well motivated, stops the bishop coming to, you could say, its best square really, or a very attacking square. c3 from Ding. Now you can see we've got on the board this particular structure, and we saw this structure already in this match, this so-called Carlsbad structure, with this time with colours reversed. We saw it in game 3 in the Queen's Gambit declined. So just a quick compare and contrast. After this, here, so you can see the Queen's Gambit exchange variation leads to a very, very similar pawn structure after this. But we just have colours reversed, basically. But the position of the piece is slightly different. So, these bishops are very actively placed. Bishop b5. But it's all, basically, once you get a fixed structure like this, we're going to see a tight manoeuvring game. Pawn breaks aren't so important, but where the pieces are placed is very important. So bishop b5. I guess this is a logical move now that this bishop has moved away. So this bishop claims a diagonal, and black should hurry up in getting his king to safety. Otherwise white will be able to play moves like knight e5 and queen a4. So bishop d6. Excellent move. This bishop is well placed, so why not exchange it off? And both sides castle. So it's a pretty quiet start to the game, and well, you can see that Nepo with black, I think, isn't under any pressure at all, and his pieces look good. However, white does have some ideas here, playing the knight into e5 and also knight b3. So the outposts here on c5 and e5 are very important. So how does black play this? Well, you could decide to do something about this bishop straight away. I should say that Gatakamsky plays this system a lot with white. He was one of the great exponents of the London system. And, well, after a6, you can actually take here and just occupy the outpost. And white has a little bit of pressure. And if pawn takes, then you can see that white can get the c5 square under control, maybe even b4 and then knight b3. So it's very strategic. Nepo plays h6, so that's to give the bishop a flight square, so he doesn't need to worry about knight h4, which might bag that bishop. And knight e5. Kamsky has played a4 in that position quite a lot, but knight e5, of course, is one of the big strategic ideas for white in this line. You play the knight to e5. Of course, at the moment, that can't be exchanged off because white wins a piece with that fork. And the knight looks very impressive on e5. So black has to be a little bit careful here. So, for example, I don't know, let's say queen c7 with the idea of exchanging, then white can exchange and play knight b3, and once the knight gets to c5, well, those knights, both knights, look very impressive. So knight e7 avoids any trouble, and it sort of leaves this bishop dangling a bit. And now Ding starts a very long-term plan here with a4, gaining ground on the queen side. Doesn't look very impressive at the moment, but let's see what happens. a6 nudges the bishop back, and now knight d7. So Nepo wants to get rid of that knight on e5, which is fair enough. Another way to play the position is we're going to see that actually a5 causes a few problems, but black could play with a5 himself here, which does allow white to occupy that square, but I mean, maybe it's just not such a big deal. So I mean, black has to make a concession of some kind in this position. It's very hard to know which is best, but a5 is possible. In any case, Nepo played knight d7 to get rid of that knight on e5, and actually Ding decided just to exchange off because he has this very clear plan of gaining ground on the queen side. So this one pawn sort of cramps those two, and if black ever breaks with b6 or b5, that can be taken, and then the a6 pawn will be weak. And white has a strategic idea here, which is to play the knight into c5, which looks pretty good on the outpost and looks at that b7 pawn. Queen c7. Well, one of the ideas behind this is Nepo is looking at that c pawn. So in this position, now I mentioned knight b3 to c5. Sometimes white wants to play b4 and then knight b3 to c5. And that really cements the knight in place and guards that pawn. So actually queen c7 prevents b4. So queen f3, okay, looks nice and active, defends that pawn. So Ding might have an idea to play b4 in this position, but also the queen is just activating. Rook c8. Again, Nepo is putting pressure here, so he wants to make sure that b4 isn't coming. Rook a3. Interesting idea. Guarding that pawn, and yeah, it might be possible to play b4 in some positions because the pawn is guarded. There are other ways to play. I mean, I was wondering in this position whether it might be possible to advance on the king side. But there is always a risk with advancing these pawns. It can rebound on the king later. And actually black is very solid on the king side, so probably not justified. But possible. It would just take the game in a very different direction, but not Ding's style. Rook a3 played. Bishop g6. Well, possibly preempting a g4. Maybe even looking to swing the knight round to d6, which is a fine square, looking at, again at those outposts. knight b3. So Ding is just carrying on with his strategic idea of putting the knight on c5. Knight c6. So that puts a bit of pressure here. But the knight is not very well placed on c6 actually. Somehow it's not going anywhere from there. The a5 pawn is well protected. Queen g3, good move. This endgame is a little bit unpleasant for black. That knight sooner or later is going to land on c5. It can be supported by the pawn on b4. And black is always tied to defending the b7 pawn. And then, you can turn your attention to the other side of the board with potentially an advance on the king side. So Nepo, obviously not too comfortable with that. Instead, just avoids the queen exchange, queen e7. And now h4. Very interesting idea. So it takes away the g5 square. I mean, not that that was such a terrifying move, but it could pop up occasionally. But it also introduces this idea of h5. Notice Ding is advancing just the h-pawn. That means by keeping these pawns in front of the king, his king is a lot safer when it's just the h-pawn. My favourite pawn to advance on the king side, because it doesn't compromise the king position actually, but introduces this idea of h5 sometimes, just dislodging the bishop. Rook e8. So Nepo thinks, right, well, might be time to gain some counterplay with e5. Can he break? Knight c5. So Ding taking control. As I said, if this knight is cemented in place on c5, then this is an eternal problem for black, defending that pawn. So how does black deal with this? It's really not easy. There's a little tactical trick here actually, which justifies this move h4. Watch this. Now this didn't happen. I should say that Nepo decided to break with e5, but what about knight takes pawn? Okay, gets very tactical. Rook takes b6. So black wants to win back the piece, and that could just solve all the problems. But watch this. h5. Beautiful move. Bishop takes. That's forced. Knight takes e6. Threatening a mate, so that has to be taken. And now rook takes d5. This is very clever. So material is now even, but black's pawns are just shot through in this position. And white has a huge positional advantage. Very easy to gang up on this e-pawn. Potentially bishop c4 or d5. And of course, if that's taken, then, well, watch this. This even wins a piece. So all the tactics work for white. And I'm sure that Ding had planned all this when actually he went h4. It's quite possible. Anyway, beautiful little tactic. So Nepo, frustrated about landing in rather a passive position, decides to break out with e5. And here it does look tempting just to lock that knight in with b4. Because if black advances, then f3, and actually there's a lot of pressure here. I mean, maybe Ding was worried that this rook would be temporarily sidelined, but that is possible. Instead, he went rook b3, which is very interesting. So obviously threatening the pawn on b7. And if rook b8, then that rook just goes further, and this is actually very unpleasant for black. But after rook b3, knight takes a5. Rook takes, so it's getting very tactical now. So material is even. Queen is attacked. Queen f6. So the position has changed a little bit. Rook a3, but it's clear that white has excellent pieces here. The knight is attacked, and, well, yeah, black has to be very careful because that pawn on b7 is hanging. Knight c4 from Nepo. Rook takes d5, not a good idea here. There's a lot hanging. Knight takes rook, there's a rook here. So after knight c4, that was taken pretty smartly. Now it's a really complicated position. Material at the moment is level, but obviously white is more active, and this pawn is dangling. Ding goes for quite a tactical line with h5. Or at least it allowed a tactical possibility. He could have taken on b7. And this does seem to give white a big advantage. Maybe there was something here he didn't like, but it looks pretty good. And you can either recapture with queen or pawn, actually, but it does look pretty good for white. White is very solid there. You know, everything's protected. And the king has a nice safe square on h2. That was another bonus of advancing the h-pawn, that the king now has some luft. But h5 played. And at this point, Ding had around 34 minutes remaining. Nepo with black had round about an hour left. So 14 moves to play in an hour. So he has loads of time to think things through, and it is highly tactical. But he only spent 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes on this next move, which was extraordinary. Here, Nepo played bishop c2. He could have taken here. Now this is a very tactical line. And after pawn takes, there's an incredible move in this position. And that's queen d8. So that temporarily exploits the fact that there's a perpetual on here. So if pawn takes bishop, there's a check, and a check here, and a check here. The king goes back. And queen d1, that's perpetual. And of course, if queen here, then queen takes pawn, and that picks up the knight. So just for a moment, that knight is loose. Now, after queen d8, white can still play on with queen f3. And there are still some amazing lines here. But there's an incredible move that black has here. I mean, this is a computer line. But Nepo is brilliant at calculating. And I feel that if he'd invested time in this position, I think he could have found this. And the idea of queen d2 is after pawn takes, check, and then you pick up the knight on c5. It's still not over. I mean, white is better here, but with just major pieces on the board, black has decent drawing chances. That was the moment. But instead, Nepo played bishop c2. And this bishop is loose. And now Ding took on b7, and h5 is justified. I mean, this pawn is excellent on h5. It cramps the king. As we'll see a little later on, that is significant. So what's the score? Ding with white is 1 pawn up. And this knight is looking pretty good if he can stabilise on c5. In fact, it comes back to the way things went. It comes back to another square. After queen b6, knight d6. Excellent move. If that's taken, then check and queen takes queen. So knight d6 just played. Rook attacked, rook takes, and queen takes. Queen on a beautiful position. Queen takes b2. Rook a5. Okay, this rook activating really nicely. And material is level, but you can see that white's pieces really dominate in this position. And I think that's shown by this variation. if queen takes pawn, knight e8 is a winning move, because g7 is attacked and there's simply no decent defence. So what did Nepo do? Well, he played king h7, best move. And now it's still not so easy. So let's just have a quick look at knight e8. I mean, that's the move we would like to play here. But watch what happens. Rook takes, queen check, and we have this drawing mechanism again, and so on. And well, there are other moves don't quite work. You know, white can't really escape this. So that was the point of king h7, that it's no longer check when white recaptures. And here is where Ding played a very natural move. He decided to activate his rook with rook c5. The computers come up with something very different. The computers believe that queen e1 is the best move. And, of course, the computers are right. It's not a very human move to retreat the queen from this excellent position in the middle of the board, but it is very strong. It's a very materialistic move, actually. The queen simply defends the pawn, and basically it's hard for black to play a decent move here. This pawn is dropping, and here's the point. After bishop d3, knight takes pawn anyway, because if bishop takes, queen takes, picks up the rook in the corner. Oh, and by the way, it's not perpetual check in this position, because you have g3 and the queen comes back to g2, and that's winning for white. So queen e1, it's very materialistic. It basically just wins that pawn for white, and white has a big advantage. But Ding played rook c5, and black still has a chance here. Queen takes c3 was, again, it's very computery, but queen takes c3 was the best try. There's also a5. It's tricky. Anyway, queen c1 check played, and f6, and now Ding is back in the driving seat again. Queen g3. This is black's problem, that the 7th rank is now open after f6. The king is well protected on h2, and it's very hard for black now. Well, indeed, black should be lost. a5, Nepo seeking counterplay, but it's too little too late. Knight takes pawn. a4. And this is very impressive from Ding. He still had, let me see, 5 moves to get to the time control at move 40. Now he had around about 12-13 minutes remaining. And many players would have played rook c7 here, threatening mate, which forces the queen back to g5. And it's possible for white to play this endgame. And this is certainly better for white. Is it winning? Good winning chances, but not absolutely clear cut. Not with that pawn there, and which leaves the knight rather sidelined. But instead of that, Ding held his nerve. He played knight e3, which moves away from that pawn. Risky when you're running short of time. But the point is that it shuts out black's queen from g5. Great move. Bishop b1 played. I should say that after a3, rook c7, you can see mate threatened. Rook has to defend passively, and this is going to be winning. The rook simply goes behind the pawn. Something similar happened in the game, but black is just too passive there. So knight e3 played, bishop b1, rook c7, white closing in, mate threatened, knight d5, threatening to take here, king h8, rook a7, just going behind that pawn, knight e7, attacking the rook, rook f8. So both players had reached the time control. This is move 40. And now Ding could take his time to try and find the cleanest win. It's still not absolutely obvious. You know, there are a lot of tempting moves here. Queen d6, queen c7. Do you push the pawns? Do you move the knight back? It's not absolutely obvious. But Ding sat and thought here and found an absolutely beautiful way to win. This is incredible. And he found it pretty quickly, actually. I mean, this is so impressive. d5. You know, I was watching this and thinking, okay, so maybe he just wants to push this. But a2. Well, d6 isn't so clear, actually. But now watch what Ding did. Queen c7. I thought, okay, at first this looked weird because he's combining two ideas. You know, he's looking down here, but okay, why did he play d5? Okay, first of all, let's just mention knight g6 check, followed by queen g7, mate, that's the threat. So king h7, knight g6, threatens the rook, which of course has to move to g8 to guard g7. Okay, so what's the idea? How is white breaking through? Okay, I should leave it to you. White to play and win cleanly in this position. This is absolutely brilliant. After Ding's next move, Nepo resigned. Queen f7. A clean kill. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, first of all, let's just deal with bishop takes. Then pawn takes. This is the easy variation. Takes, takes, and mate on the back rank. Easy. Okay, well, what about, let's say, queen takes c3? What exactly is white threatening? Here we go. Queen takes rook. Rook a8 check. If the king moves here, then rook h8. And if king f7, rook f8 mate. That's why he played d5. It wasn't to push the d pawn to the queening square. It was simply to cover e6 so that white has created a mating net. This is absolutely brilliant. And look at the pawn on h5 playing a key role in this mating net as well, guarding the knight. Absolutely brilliant. A gold coin moment. And another age. Gold coins would have been chucked at the board after that. Absolutely brilliant. So that was the final position. And Nepomniachtchi resigned in that position. Wow. Just a brilliant game. This is like a mirror of the game from yesterday, where we also had queen, rook and knight outplaying queen, bishop and rook. And we also had an almost flawless strategic performance by Nepo. And today we had really a flawless strategic performance from Ding. Of course, there were minor inaccuracies, but basically Ding played just brilliantly in this game and completely outplayed Nepo. And it's one of those games where, looking at this as a whole, you know, with the naked eye, you just kind of think, well, where did Nepo make his mistakes? You can pinpoint certain moments. The computer finds very tricky defenses, and you know, maybe earlier he could have done something about this advance of the a pawn by playing a5 himself. But I mean, really, this was flawless by Ding. Absolutely superb. And he said afterwards, actually, he wasn't so influenced by yesterday's loss. I mean, it takes incredible equanimity to come back and play a game like this. He said, I wanted to stay calm and play something I knew well. That's why he chose the London system. And he said, I feel very pleased with the ideas, rightly so. And Nepo just said, well, I had a bad day. And sometimes the tension is very high, so you can't perform at your best. But, you know, it's curious. We have, Nepo playing absolutely brilliantly and very calmly yesterday, and yet today in that critical position where I think this was the moment after Ding played h5, very plausible move, but here Nepo didn't knuckle down, he didn't find the best defense, which, he's capable of incredible calculation. So there we go, another decisive game. The score in the match 3-all, and we go into a rest day. I wonder if the players can just kind of calm down and settle and play something very stable. We'll see. It is an amazing match. Thanks for watching. Oh, by the way, if you're not a subscriber, click that subscribe button.